Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. Today is the second half of the conversation around financial decision making. Last week, we talked about how emotion drives all of our decisions and how we understand where that emotion is coming from and make different decisions by having different thoughts that lead to different emotions. Now I want to talk about another big influence on our financial decisions, and that is our past. We have a lot of evidence for our brain to draw from for our past mistakes, our past financial failures, the things that we've done that have hurt us in the past. And our past will frame so often what we do in our futures. We will end up using our past and a lot of times using it to make bad financial decisions, ironically. We will look at those past failures and we will either medicate those by spending money we don't have now in order to feel better. We will use that as evidence that we're never going to be good at this and we're never going to be able to do it and we should just give up and quit. We'll use those past successes to assume that we'll always have enough in the future, and we'll borrow aggressively and count on the future being better than the present, because in the past, we've seen some evidence of that. And so the past has a huge impact on the way that we approach our future. And we need to recognize how that affects us. One of the things I see a lot of times when people approach their past financial decisions is a lot of shame. They feel really deeply shameful about things they've done in the past and the level of credit card debt that they have, or that car that they bought that was a total waste of money, or the way that they spent recklessly on clothes or status. And they will tell themselves a story about how bad they were or how bad they've been and how it hurt them. And oftentimes that story is a perpetual conversation with themselves. They're talking all the time with themselves about how dumb they are or how bad they've been in the past. And that shame is not helpful. It's not actually leading them to progress. It's keeping them stuck in self-loathing and self-deprecation and basically dismissing their own value because of mistakes they've made in the past. And that leads me to one of my favorite quotes around this topic, a quote by a woman named Byron Katie. She makes the statement, when you argue with your past, you lose, but only 100% of the time. And I love that quote. I use that quote in my own mind all the time because we spend a lot of energy telling ourselves what we wish was different. I wish I hadn't bought that thing. I wish I hadn't spent that money. I wish I hadn't wasted my time there or wasted my career there. I wish I hadn't taken that step or been in that relationship. How many things can we tell ourselves would be different if we had made different decisions in the past? You're not going to. You can't go back and make a different decision. That's what she means by when you argue with your past and say, it should have been different, I should have done something else, I shouldn't have done this. You lose that argument every time. And you always will. And yet we have that conversation playing on repeat and it is influencing the decisions that we're making now. A lot of times, the way that our past shapes our future is that we end up repeating similar mistakes. They rhyme. They're not exactly the same, but they're pretty similar. And so we think that what I learned from this past situation was that I just need to gain more status in my career. I need to climb the corporate ladder. I need to get the next title. I need to shoot for the promotions, because that is what really was lacking in the past. And we end up making decisions and sacrificing things that we actually don't want to sacrifice for something that isn't actually going to give us what we think it's going to give us. We decide that if we just had this level of house or this level of car, what I've learned from my past is that I was embarrassed by this car that I bought, and so I'm going to spend even more money on the next nicer car. I was embarrassed by the status or the situation I was in with where I lived, and so I'm going to overshoot in order to overcompensate for what I experienced in my past. And we end up making mistakes that are maybe on the different end of the spectrum, but they're still mistakes related to finding our significance in our stuff, finding our security in our wealth, or finding our status and importance and power in our career path or in our neighborhood that we live in. And we end up in similar cycles. Even if they're not exactly the same, we're repeating mistakes. They're rooted in the same emotion and the same spiritual condition. We're still seeing these things as ours. We're still taking ownership of them rather than being stewards. We're still finding our emotional connection and our security and our sense of confidence in things and stuff and money rather than in God. We are doing the same thing. And so we end up arguing with our past and then doing the same thing, just a different flavor of the same thing. And that's what I find so fascinating about how our past shapes our future. I end up seeing people a lot of times just confused. How did this happen? I talk about this idea of the lure of more, that if we just get more, if we just have more, we'll end up happier. If we just keep going, then we're going to finally figure out what level of status and wealth and significance or stuff will get us to a place of satisfaction. But all we're doing is sacrificing more and more to get more and more. And then that becomes normal. We get used to it. And it's not as exciting and delightful as it used to be. And so we need more. And we just keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again. So what I think is most important in order to harness those past experiences is to approach them with less judgment, less self-loathing, more grace and kindness towards yourself, and certainly towards your past self. Look at them with less anger or disappointment or frustration. Look at those moments where there was pain or difficulty or something you see as a mistake in your past, and ask yourself how you grew from it, what you've learned from it, rather than just assuming that it was a waste. I do believe that God is for us, and in those past experiences, He is growing us, He is shaping us, and He is moving us forward, even if we don't recognize it. And when we argue with ourselves and argue with our past, we don't recognize the growth. We stay stuck in the pain. And so, first and foremost, turn to those stories and ask better questions. What was driving that? What was the emotion that was moving me in that decision? What was the thought that I was having that was driving that emotion? How did I get there? How am I doing similar things today? What about the decisions I'm making today feel similar, or maybe are a big reaction to kind of the opposite experience of those failures? And how am I setting myself up for just different versions of that same experience? No judgment, no self-loathing, no anger towards yourself, just neutral. Look at what happened and recognize the growth. then you can turn with that learning, with that growth, and now apply that to your future. Don't do a big reaction, a big overcorrection. Have a less extreme emotional connection to those past experiences, what you may consider to be failure, and just start evaluating it as an event that happened and what did I gain from it. A great way to think of it is, what decision did I make and why, rather than what's wrong with me? Why do I keep doing this? Why am I such an idiot, right? When we chastise ourselves and argue with ourselves, we are belittling a child of God. We are destroying the identity and the beauty and the value of one of God's precious ones, because we are dismissing them. They happen to also be us. We are doing those things to ourselves. We wouldn't want to do that to somebody else, but we treat ourselves with such contempt. And then the ultimate irony is we end up finding ourselves in similar situations in the future, and then we have more reason to self-loathe, more reason to say, what's wrong with me? Why can't I get this right? Why do I keep making the same mistakes? Well, there's a reason that you keep making the same mistakes. And it's not until you can put down the argument and the self-judgment that you'll actually be able to understand why you keep making those mistakes and not beat yourself up over it, but actually change from it. I think one of the most important things that we can learn from our past and apply to our future is the seasons we were in where we were unintentional, where we were not making clear-headed decisions, where we were being drug along by emotion, by a desire to be important, a desire to feel significant, a desire to overcome and overcompensate for our sense of failure. We can see those seasons because in most of those seasons, we also will see a lack of tracking of what our life costs, a lack of awareness of what we were actually spending. We will see a lack of understanding of our earning, what's coming in and what's going out. Some of the basic fundamentals of how we approach faithful stewardship, we will see disappeared in those seasons. So often, the thing that we can do to kind of combat that repeated pattern is the basic fundamentals. It's the blocking and tackling of understanding our spending, tracking it well, understanding our earning, tracking it well, understanding our net worth, and recognizing how it is growing or not growing, and seeing those patterns that will show us where we're making progress or where we're actually starting to lose ground. Because that's the evidence that our brain needs to start to have motivation to do something different. Generally speaking, when we look back at our past and we see these repeated mistakes or repeated issues, it's because we don't actually have understanding in those seasons of what's really happening. We're just making decisions almost as if they're happening on autopilot. And that's why we see so much confusion. People come through these seasons and I don't even know how I got this much credit card debt. I have no idea how I ended up here. Or I don't know how I ended up buying this house that I absolutely couldn't have afforded. There was no way this math worked. How did I get here? More often than not, it's because there was a lack of just basic understanding of their reality. And so recognize that in those patterns. Don't argue with yourself and tell yourself you're stupid or dismiss your value, but just see that it is in the basic fundamentals of faithful stewardship that we actually gain freedom from some of these patterns. We actually start to recognize where they're coming from, what they're costing us, and we actually have reason and motivation to do it differently. If we're still stuck in this lack of awareness, we're subject to the same patterns. It's only when we investigate what happened, understand where we are now, that we can then make different decisions in the future. I want so desperately for our past to be a source of wisdom, to be something we can look back on and see where we can learn and how we can grow, rather than it being a source of self-loathing. Because when we see what we've learned and we apply it to our future, our progress is greater. Our multiplication is higher. Our ability to be in a position for future obedience is greater. We can actually take steps forward and lead others to do the same. And so seeing that past experience as a gift, taking from it what God has for us in it, and then turning and facing our future with clarity, knowing what our life costs, knowing where these decisions and these motivations are coming from, allows us to not repeat the same mistakes that we've made in the past. We will make new mistakes, and that's fine. Let's just make new ones. Let's learn and grow and continue to make progress, rather than being stuck in patterns that are rooted most of the time in arguing with ourselves and setting ourselves up to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. Let's make new mistakes so we can learn new things and we can teach others what we're learning. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you all have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.